is Allen a Lafayette scholar, but when Lafayette came through on his farewell tour, and this was 1824 to 1825, he visited all 24 states at the time that comprised the United States, including Georgia. Lafayette made a 13-month, excuse me, a 13-month tour, and it was the farewell tour, and it was at the invitation of President James Monroe in Congress. And when he arrived, Allen will tell you more, but there were celebrations bar none. And it was because not only he was Revolutionary War hero, but because he was all about courage and loyalty and honor, and they celebrated him all across the country, including when he came across Georgia. And on March 19th, he arrived at Savannah, 1825. March 31st, he crossed over the Chattahoochee into Alabama. So for that week, he came through. Now, furthermore, he had with him, Lafayette did, private secretary, Auguste Levasseur, who journaled this, chronicled it in French. There had been no single unreached version of a translation until Allen decided he would do that deed. And he did, and in 2006, he published this work, which is still, it's now in its third printing. It's also has a Kindle version for those of you who are digitized. But hardback is available, and it's Lafayette in America in 1824 and 1825. And so, thank you again for coming, and Alan Hoffman, we appreciate your being here.
Your check is in the mail.
Thank you, Richard. Save something for me, though. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess I'll just start by saying that this is my first visit to LaGrange, and I paired it with a visit to Mobile. One of my goals has been to visit each of the 24 states that Lafayette visited during the farewell tour and to speak publicly in each of them, and I accomplished that goal Tuesday and Wednesday in Mobile, Alabama. And I told Richard that I was going to Mobile, and he said, "Why don't you come to LaGrange?" I said, "Great, let's do it." So I drove 4 hours from Mobile yesterday, and Richard had this itinerary to show me when I arrived, and it's literally about 12 items between 8 and 7 tonight. So we're on about item number 8, and I'm still standing. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about Lafayette, the farewell tour, or my visit, or anything else for that matter.
I'd like to know if you could kind of expand on LaGrange and Lafayette and the relationship.
Okay. Well, Lafayette in the 19th century, principally as a result of the farewell tour, became an American icon. He saw and really glad-handed about 3 million people, 1/4 of the population, during the farewell tour. And as a result of that, there were numerous namings: people, streets, squares, towns, cities, counties, townships. There are actually 80 of the latter, cities, towns, townships, and counties named for Lafayette. I know this because on a rainy day about 7 years ago, I went through the Rand McNally Atlas. I went through the listing of cities for every state, and I did Lafayette, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Lincoln, etc. He's right up there with Madison, actually. But there are six names that you see. One is, of course, like Lafayette, Louisiana, or sometimes Lafayette, as I've been told. Fayetteville, like Fayetteville, North Carolina, Fayetteville, Arkansas. Fayette, or Fayette. There's a Lafayetteville, several of them up north. And then there's LaGrange and LaGrangeville. The reason LaGrange was the chateau that Lafayette lived in. It came down in his wife's family, but after the French Revolution, imprisonment in Austria and Germany, and exile, he returned to France in 1799 and lived at his farm, his wife's farm, at LaGrange, for the rest of his life. He also had like apartments in Paris. So when he was here during the farewell tour, people learned, if they didn't know before, that he lived in LaGrange. And we know this because in the book that I did, for example, this big festival that they had in Castle Garden, New York, in the middle of this festival, someone flashed a transparency, and it was a picture of his home. And he was very moved by that. He says, "Ma maison, LaGrange." So people knew that he was from LaGrange. So one of the namings, or one of the names that was chosen to honor him, was LaGrange. Now the legend about LaGrange, Georgia, is that, and by the way, there are about 15 LaGranges, either counties or cities or towns. But the legend about LaGrange, Georgia, is that when he didn't get up here, he passed through Georgia a little below Columbus. But the legend is he admired the land that he saw in western Georgia, and he said, "It looks like my home." And as a result of that, the people who established the town in the late 1820s, mid to late 1820s, chose the name LaGrange, and that's why you have that name. Anyone else? Well, yeah, sure. So I'm the president of the American Friends of Lafayette. It's an organization that has been in existence since 1932. We have we have 400 mailing addresses, but we have about 500 members, because many of them are family members, probably between 500 and 600 members. And the charter of the American Friends of Lafayette is to remind Americans about Lafayette and all he did for this country and his importance in American history. And one of the things that we are involved in is plans to celebrate the bicentennial of the farewell tour. Now, the farewell tour occurred in 1824 and 1825. When the way I got my passion, my wife would say obsession with Lafayette, was I read a book about the 50th anniversary of the country, and the whole first chapter was about the farewell tour. I had taken all history courses the last 2 years of college, mostly early American history. I took a French history course. I knew generally who Lafayette was, and I said to myself, what's all the fuss about? I'd never heard of the farewell tour. So that's how I got started, and that's how I wound up translating this book, because I wanted to read the primary sources about the farewell tour. So what we're trying to do, and you know, to tell you a little bit about the farewell tour, he was lionized in every state. He visited all 24 states. In almost every major and even minor cities, there were banquets, there were balls, there were parades. In many cities, they constructed welcome Lafayette arches out of wood to greet him. Each city and town appointed what they used to call a committee of arrangements, and they did all the planning. They sent out invitations for the ball, you know, and the like. So he was really a rock star, and the only analogies that I could make is, for example, the way the Beatles were treated by young teenagers in particular when they arrived in the 60s, or the excitement that John Paul II generated when he came to this country in 1979. And it's as a result of the farewell tour that we have all these namings, and really that you have LaGrange. For example, in 1826, as a result of Lafayette's visit to Philadelphia, the people of Easton, Pennsylvania, they had traveled to meet him when he was there, and they named their college Lafayette College. They had already gotten a charter for it. They didn't have a name. In my state, actually I know the day, it's October 19th, 1824 in New Hampshire, the people of Franconia named their mountain Mount Lafayette. And there's a Lafayette river in southern Virginia, and also a Lake Lafayette in Florida. So the streets, I mean, in almost every major city, you'll have streets with one of those forms. Not Fayetteville Street or Lafayetteville Street, but the other four. There are LaGrange streets, LaGrange avenues, Fayette Street or Avenue, Lafayette Street or Lafayette Avenue. I work in Boston, and he came to Boston in 1824 on August 24th, and there was a parade into Boston, and then he marched, he got out of the carriage, and he walked down on the Boston Common to get to the State House, right, if you know Boston, right next to Tremont Street. School children were on either side of him, girls on one side, boys on the other, all sporting Lafayette ribbons. Well, that particular street its legal name is the Lafayette Mall in honor of that event, but there are 7 other streets in Boston that are either Lafayette Street or Fayette Street or LaGrange Streets or Avenue. They put up a hotel in downtown Boston maybe 15 years ago, and they had to come up with a different name. It was the Lafayette Hotel, so they called that street De Lafayette Street. That's the 8th one. In New York, there are 10. There are 10 streets named for Lafayette. So he's all over. I remember being on, I went to Hyannisport, Massachusetts, which is where the Kennedy compound was. I was supposed to meet someone at a country club, and I got lost. I got to the yacht club and not the country club. So I asked someone. He says, well, just go up Washington Street and make a left, and you'll be right there. So I drive up Washington Street, and it's a dead end on Lafayette Street in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. He was never there, but his reputation was there, in particular in the 19th century. So anyhow, getting back to my story. So we want to communicate the excitement that Richard and I share about Lafayette to others. And one of the ways, there are many ways that we can do it, but one of the ways is to make a kind of a big deal about the bicentennial of the tour. And we're trying to raise money and to create events in advance of the tour. And depending upon how well we do in the fundraising aspect, for example, we could actually strive to, if we really do well, we could reproduce his roots throughout the United States and have a Lafayette reenactor go from city to city, town to town the way he did. One thing he did was when he started in New York, New England, then he went south, and then he did the deep south, and then he went west, going through Georgia and Alabama, and then up the Mississippi, did all the other states. But what he did was, whenever they could, because the roads were so pathetic, they took an inland steamboat, actually also coastal steamboats. So some of his route would be getting on a steamboat and stopping at various places. Now, on the Ohio River, however, he was involved in a shipwreck. I don't know if we want to recreate that one. And he and the rest were almost killed. The ship hit what they call a snag, and it went down, and they had to escape the ship. But anyhow, so that's kind of, if you don't think big, you're not going to do a lot. So that's some of our thinking. Now, Richard, here for LaGrange, I think you have a unique opportunity here. And the reason for that is you have that wonderful statue in the square there. You also have that wonderful original Houdon bust in this building. And you have the name associated with Lafayette. And although there are archives in other cities, for example, at Lafayette College and also at the University of Cornell, there's no, Lafayette institution, whether it be a museum or some other institution that honors and promotes Lafayette's memory. So that would be something that would be fantastic for LaGrange to do, and obviously it would be great to attract guests and tourism and the like. And so that's also, I know it's part of Richard's thinking, and our organization would also like to help doing that. So the question is, why Lafayette? And the answer, in my view, is, number one, he helped us in a major way in our revolution, not only militarily but diplomatically. He went on furlough in 1779, and he helped to persuade the French ministry to send French land troops and return the fleet to America. And then when he came back, he got involved with the Virginia campaign and the siege of Yorktown, which were probably the primary military exploits here in America. And then in the 1780s, he basically became a dual citizen. He loved America as much, if not more, than he loved France. So he was lobbying for American interests. He was a general by that time in the French army to open up numerous ports to American trade, including whale oil. And I tell the story that in 1824, when he was here, Jefferson took him to an event at the University of Virginia, which had just been constructed in the rotunda. It was a dinner, and he gave a speech. He actually didn't give it. He had it read for him. He didn't like public speaking, plus he was getting on in years at the time. So he said in his speech, he talked about the fact that Jefferson, he was the minister in France, and he was trying to get these things done, but it was Lafayette who was most involved with badgering the ministry, et cetera. And with regard to these favorable trade openings that were accomplished, he said, and I quote, "I only held the nail, Lafayette drove it," meaning it was Lafayette who really got it done. So he was always in favor of American interests. There was another story that is associated with that. So another thing that Lafayette did, in addition to opening up numerous ports to American products, including whale oil, he negotiated with the city of Paris to have Nantucket whalers supply all the whale oil for all the streetlights in Paris, and he was successful in that. So in 1786, the Nantucket town meeting voted to create a 500-pound cheese out of 1 day's milk of every cow on the island and send it to Lafayette, which they did. And, that's like sending coals to Newcastle. But in 1950, a children's book appeared called A Cheese for Lafayette, and in the reverse jacket, it tells the story of that town meeting. So he continued to support American interests really throughout his life. I want to also make the point that in addition to be a great military leader in America and a diplomat on behalf of America, he was also a human rights advocate throughout his life. And this took many forms. So, for example, in the 1780s in France, the Protestants were second-class citizens. After the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, they couldn't worship publicly, they couldn't bury their dead in certain cemeteries, etc. And Lafayette decided to meet with the leaders and to lobby with the king and his ministers. And he introduced some of the leaders to some of the ministers. And in 1788, even before the French Revolution, as a result of Lafayette's work, he passed a decree ameliorating the condition of the Protestants. Of course, in the French Revolution, they did get equal rights with the Catholics. He also was for prison reform. He did not believe, having experienced it himself, solitary confinement. He was in favor of expanded suffrage, and towards the end of his life, universal manhood suffrage. One of his last speeches that he gave was against the death penalty. He is quoted as saying in the Chamber of Deputies that I will forever be against the death penalty until you can demonstrate to me that man is infallible. And perhaps the single most, he spent most time on his life in the cause of the African-American slave, in particular the American slaves. This goes back to 1783. So the war had ended really only early in 1783 with the signing of the peace treaty. And he writes his paternal friend, George Washington, now that you're going to have, my dear general, now that you're going to have some time on your hands, you and I ought to buy a plantation in America and free the slaves, have them work as day laborers, educate them, and with your name associated with this project, it will serve as an example to others. Well, Washington writes back a very nice, kind, but sort of patronizing letter about how idealistic you are young man, and why don't we talk about it when you come to America? So Lafayette did come to America in 1784. There's no record of any conversation they had, but it never got done in America. But in 1785, Lafayette and his wife bought a plantation in Cayenne on the northern coast of South America, and they did that. The plantation had 80 slaves, which came with the land. He hired an overseer, gave him very specific instructions to educate them, to pay them for their work until they accumulated enough money to be freed. It was like an experiment. Unfortunately, during the French Revolution, when all of his estate was confiscated, that plantation was confiscated as well before the project could be completed. Now, he goes over, he's a general in the French army. The Jacobins take over. They send an arrest warrant for him. This is 1792. And he goes over the border thinking he'd get to America. He winds up in jail, basically, in prison, because the Prussians arrested him and later turned him over to the Austrians. So he's now in Magdeburg. This is early 1793. Doesn't know what's going on in France. Doesn't know what's happened to his wife or his children. And he gets a letter out to an aunt of his wife who was in exile in Holland. And he writes in a postscript to this letter, "If you hear from Adrienne, make sure she does not let our Cayenne project fail and the Negroes lose their freedom," quote unquote. So this is on his mind when, a normal man would have, his own family and his children and what's happening to them, what's going on in France. So he was very dedicated to this cause, and he was still at it in the 1820s. I'll give you one or two more examples, but in 1821, his two best American friends were Washington and Jefferson. And Jefferson, as he aged, became much more skeptical about freeing the slaves and much less willing to consider it. So in 1820, 1821, it was the time of the Missouri Compromise, and the issue was whether slavery should be expanded to some of the new territories, the Louisiana territories, and there were bills in the Congress. Ultimately, they did reach a compromise. But while this was going on, Jefferson, the elder statesman, was advocating a policy of diffusion. And what he meant by that, which he explained to Lafayette in a letter, that the terrible conditions under which African American slaves lived are on the tidewaters, on the coast, because of overcrowding. And if we spread slaves throughout the territory, including the new territories, it will ameliorate conditions for everyone. So Lafayette writes back, "My dear Mr. Jefferson, do you really believe that by agreeing to spread a scourge, we can ever hope to eradicate it?" The last letter he wrote to Jefferson, before Jefferson's death in early 1826, he's still harping on the fact that slavery in the South is what is preventing us from advocating for and getting Europe to adopt American principles. It's the principal reason why we have not been able to make progress in Europe, etc. So that was a very important part of his life, and his position was gradual education and gradual emancipation. There's one other Jefferson story. So there's a ex-Jefferson slave who sometimes is called Israel Jefferson. He wound up in Ohio, where Madison Hemmings also wound up, and he was interviewed by an Ohio magazine in the 1860s. And he told this story. He says he was like a coachman, he claimed, for Jefferson. He said, "I was in a coach. I heard Mr. Jefferson in the presence of numerous guests, and the only one that I remember is General Lafayette." And then he tells the story that they were on their way to the University of Virginia, and he heard this conversation. He was listening intently. And the conversation was that Lafayette was grousing that, I didn't come to this country and spend my money and risk my life to save some of the people. I came to free all of the people. And the African Americans, they should be educated and they should be given their freedom. And the response that Israel Jefferson says Thomas Jefferson made was this: As to the first proposition that you've made, that they should be educated, I agree that they should learn, they should be taught how to read, but not to write, lest they forge their papers. As to the second, I do not disagree with you in principle, but I do not foresee a time when it shall come to pass. So Lafayette was pushing this. While he was here in 1825, he sent his friend John Marshall an abolitionist pamphlet to read. I mean, when he was visited with James Madison, he brought up the subject of slavery at a dinner party at James Madison's house. So he was really an advocate for that cause. It was very important to him. So anyhow, just get back to, LaGrange and the American Friends of Lafayette. We think, and I agree with Richard on this, that this man is an extraordinary man, that his life and his career, his principles are something that should be studied by young people and can make a difference to young people. This man risked his principles for everything. He was consistent in his principles throughout his life. So I know Richard's hope is to create an institution here in LaGrange that would honor Lafayette and would educate, in particular, young people, and teach them character, really, through the life of this man. Any other questions? Have I covered it all? I can talk more about his abolitionist work, and there's kind of a neat part of this that takes place after his death, actually. So, as a result of the farewell tour, he was the most popular man in America for at least 50 years. Take my word for it. And so in 1834 he dies. And he was very friendly with some British abolitionists, in particular Thomas Clarkson. Did any one of you see the movie Amazing Grace? It came out about 10 years ago. It was about the British movement to get rid of the slave trade. Well, Thomas Clarkson was the hippie in that movie. He was an Oxford student who wrote an essay. He won an essay contest, and the contest, he was assigned the pro on slavery is wrong. And he became so committed, he did that. He was going to be a minister, but basically he was an abolitionist the rest of his life. And he went to Europe, to France often, etc. Anyhow, he became friendly with Lafayette in the French Revolution. So, and he visited France on a number of occasions when Lafayette returned to France. So in 1845, there was a man by the name of, he's the first Cassius Clay, Cassius Marcellus Clay, for whom the fighter was originally named. He was a cousin of Henry Clay from Lexington, Kentucky. And he was an abolitionist. He was also a senator, and yet he was an abolitionist. So he was building he wanted to start an abolitionist newspaper in Lexington, Kentucky. Now what you have to know is that Lexington, Kentucky is Fayette County. That's the whole city, and that's all Fayette County is. So he buys this printing press and he starts printing, and the locals destroy the press. He buys a second one, and they threatened to kill him. So he moved over the river. He went to Ohio. And this incensed Thomas Clarkson, and he wrote this letter to a Boston abolitionist in which he said, and I'm going to quote what he said. He said, "I was with Lafayette many, many times, and I heard him say on more than one occasion, I would never have drawn my sword for America had I known that thereby that I was helping to found a nation of slavery." And then he ended the letter by saying, "And those people of Fayette County should know better, that they've dishonored the person whose name was given to their home." Well, that letter was published in the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's paper, in January of 1846. And it became like an anthem for the Northern abolitionists in particular. It is cited, that statement about Lafayette is cited in speeches by such luminaries as Charles Sumner, Wendell Phillips, William C. Nell, who was an African-American abolitionist, etc. There was there was a memorial service for John Brown after he was executed in late 1859. The account of that service says that on the wall were various placards. One of them was, "I would never have drawn my sword for America if I had known that thereby I was helping to found a nation of slavery." And then underneath it says Lafayette, but they're all exclamation points. That placard, or one of them, broadside, was given to the Boston Public Library. I've seen it. It was given by the William Lloyd Garrison family. So he became, because of his underlying popularity as a result of the farewell tour, and because of Clarkson's letter, he really became I don't know what the exact word is, but he became an important figure to the abolitionist movement in the antebellum period. So, anyhow, that's my story. Go ahead, Richard. Can I call Richard up? Why don't you come up to the microphone? Richard, come up to the mic.
Just to conclude on 2 points, this whole bicentennial idea of celebrating the farewell tour. So 1825 is when it will be applicable here in our community. I have spoken with the LaGrange Society for the Performing Arts, the LaGrange Art Museum, the Troup County Historical Society and Legacy Museum, plus the Lafayette Alliance. We hope to recruit others. And they are agreed in principle that we will work toward the idea of celebrating that bicentennial tour in 2025. Each of those organizations has its own mission. Fine. They will pursue that mission, but will have the common theme and the common narrative of Lafayette. So, the question often is asked, why does Lafayette not have a Hamilton? It is an excellent question. And there's no reason that we shouldn't have that. It simply takes undistracted moments to sit down and think through the story, talent and resources. And it can be done. I'm convinced that we have the talent in this community. Well, what if it doesn't get to Broadway? Fine, it doesn't get to Broadway. Sufficient to the purpose. So we want to work on this bicentennial idea, and community cohesion is part of that, all elements of our community. The second idea that Alan has put forth is a grand idea. It's not a drive-by at all. And that is, there is no place in the world that can be identified as a Lafayette interpretive center. Somewhere where you can go and learn Lafayette, the philosophy, the history, the geography. Well, LaGrange, our namesake, and that Mason statue gives us a leg up on that. But it takes imagination, creativity, and innovation to do something like that. It must be immersive. It must be hands-on. How do we do that? So Lafayette was all about the grand ideas. That needs to be a forefront. But he was also about fencing, horseback riding, sailing, musket firing, and tomahawk throwing. He was a favorite of the Native Americans. Cayula was the name they called it. So thinking in those terms is grand thinking, but it's going to take a lot of creativity and a lot of imagination and folks feeling that force and sitting down to think about it. But in my mind, it is something that is doable. So I want to thank Alan Hoffman for coming. We have put him through a full day, and he has done yeoman service here. And furthermore, although I must tell you, I have enjoyed his coming and being able to see what LaGrange has here, what is here. And I think he has been impressed. And I thank you all for coming. If there are no other questions, we're done.